At first light, her horse returned alone, its flank streaked with dried blood, saddle hanging empty. No scream, no note, just a trail cut deep into Apache land. Folks expected war, but what waited in that silence wasn't hatred. It was a warrior who broke his tribe's law, not for glory, not for ransom, but to bring one girl home alive, and that changed everything. Part 1. Dawnlight on the Rooftop of Doubt. The wind had teeth that morning. High on the northern slope of the Dragoon foothills, the chill rode down off the granite like it had purpose. John Brody, weathered and wide-shouldered, set the coffee pot on the edge of the fire pit, smoke curling into the blue-gray dawn. He didn't wear gloves. Never had. Not since that day in '76 when the winter took 3 fingers from his neighbor and 2 from the mare that wouldn't settle. He'd rather feel the cold and keep what was his. The porch boards creaked beneath his boots as he settled into the rocker, steaming tin cup in hand, eyes pointed east, not for sun, but for what the light might show. Beyond the rise, the ridgeline stretched long and still like a sleeping dog. He studied it each morning, not for beauty, but for signs, for movement, for the unlikely shape of a rider's silhouette cresting the rim, because one day something might come back. Behind him, the ranch house still smelled faintly of oilcloth, cornbread, and wood smoke from last night, but inside it was too quiet. No laughter, no clatter of boots, just the slow tick of a clock that didn't care how long a man waited. Ellie Brody had left the house early, like always. She'd never been the kind to sit for long. Raised in saddle and on rifle, she was more buckskin than silk, more range than parlor. Folks in Tombstone said she had her mother's fire and her father's silence, a combination that made men curious and then cautious. She'd ridden out with the roan mare just after dawn, rifle slung across her back, to check the lower fences along Brody's eastern stretch. That was routine. What wasn't routine was the sound of hooves clattering back less than 2 hours later, without her. John was halfway through his second cup when he heard it, a sharp beat of panic under hooves. Not gallop, more like a staggered run. He stood slowly, the way older men do when something inside tells them the world just tilted. The roan came into view with her flanks dark with sweat, sides heaving, and a long gash across the saddle leather. No rider. One stirrup broken clean off, dried blood crusted around the strap. No reins, no sound but her breath. John didn't speak, didn't cuss. He just stepped forward, took the reins gently, and ran his hand down her neck. The mare trembled but didn't shy. That was worse somehow, the kind of stillness that meant she'd seen more than a horse ought to. Ellie wasn't one to fall, and even if she had, she wouldn't have stayed down. A few ranch hands came up from the barn, boots crunching frost, faces drawn. They saw the mare and knew enough not to ask. She might have run into cats, one of them offered, uncertain. John shook his head once. No cats, cut leather. Another voice, quieter. Maybe rustlers. Rustlers don't leave saddles with blood on 'em. The men fell silent. John moved with steady purpose. Into the barn, out again with his rifle, the old Henry with the scratched barrel and oiled sling. He checked the chamber, then swung up into the saddle of his own mount. An old paint with more bone than muscle, but a nose for trouble. "Jacob, you're with me," John said to his foreman. "Round up 2 others, quiet riders." Jacob nodded and stepped off to obey. No one questioned where they were headed. Not really. The direction the mare had come from said enough. East, toward the dry Serpent Valley, a place most men in southern Arizona only spoke of when drunk or dying. The tracks were light at first, barely impressions in the frost-stiff soil. But Jacob was good with signs. By midday they could see the trail more clearly. Hoofprints, 2 mules maybe, and one rider who hadn't bled into the dirt but moved fast, not pausing, and something else. A second set of prints, smaller boots worn thin at the heel, a woman's weight uneven. Ellie had walked a little, maybe been dragged a little. Then the tracks vanished into rock. The sun hung like a copper coin overhead when the men crested a ridge overlooking the edge of Dry Serpent Valley. John dismounted without a word, crouched low. His hand brushed the bark of a low mesquite tree where something snagged, white cloth, just a shred, curled on the thorn like a ghost waving in surrender. He pinched it between his fingers. Lace, torn, and faintly, smelling of horses, dust, and something else. Blood? Maybe, or fear. Behind him, Jacob muttered, "We go down there?" John didn't answer right away. He just stared out across the ravine. The wind carried nothing, no sound, no birds, no life. The Dry Serpent didn't just scare white men. It silenced everything. Folks said it was haunted, that the ground belonged to the dead, that no army ever rode in and came out the same. But John Brodie wasn't after stories. He was after his daughter. "We go," he said, mounting again. The others hesitated. Jacob swallowed. "You think it's Apache?" John finally looked at him, not angry, not scared, just steady. "I think the truth don't care what we think." By nightfall, they'd made camp just above a shallow arroyo. No fire, no talking, just coffee brewed low and quiet, passed hand to hand like a prayer too soft to speak aloud. John sat on a flat rock, eyes to the stars, rifle across his lap. He hadn't spoken Ellie's name since morning, hadn't let himself. Names could break a man too early, but in the dark, when the others slept, he pulled a small leather pouch from inside his coat. Inside was a silver brooch, shaped like a kite in mid-flight, her mother's last gift to the girl. He pressed it in his palm and stared into the night where the ridgeline turned to black. Somewhere out there his daughter was alone, or worse, but as long as blood hadn't said otherwise, she wasn't gone, and until that day came, he'd ride into hell if he had to. Part 2. Tracks into the Forbidden Hollow. The farther east they rode, the fewer words were spoken. What little grass grew between the canyon walls had long since browned and snapped under the sun's stare. The trail turned mean, narrow, dusty, curling through gullies that didn't echo sound back, like the land had forgotten how to speak. Jacob rode just behind John, one eye on the trail, the other on the bluff above. "Still no fresh signs," he muttered once, half hoping the silence would disagree with him. But John said nothing. He just rode on. The terrain changed near mid-morning. The wash turned inward, the ground darkening with copper-stained earth. Stones wore grooves like something heavy had passed. Mule hooves, maybe. Wagon ruts, number too narrow for wheels. And above, a flight of crows wheeled once, then scattered toward the west. John's horse halted. At the base of a slanted rock wall, half buried in dust, was a piece of broken saddle strap. Not much. Just a bit of rough-cut leather, still bearing the imprint of a brand. B. Like the one stamped on all the Brodie gear, Ellie's saddle. Jacob dismounted and picked it up. "Cut clean," he said. "Sharp blade." "Or obsidian," John murmured. Jacob didn't reply. They were in Apache country now. Nobody said it, but the air said it for them. Thin, dry, and too still, like something was listening. There'd been whispers about this valley for years. Dry Serpent, a place wrapped in story, old even before the Spanish had scratched it on their maps. Folks said spirits dwelled here, neither good nor evil, just waiting, watching, the kind of stories old women told by firelight to keep boys from wandering too far. But John wasn't hunting myths. He was hunting a daughter. He turned in the saddle, motioned to the others. Two stayed back, rifles ready. Jacob followed him forward, and that's when they saw it. Atop a mesquite branch just above arm's reach, Something fluttered faintly in the breeze. A strip of pale cloth. John stood in his stirrups and reached for it. It came away easy, thin, torn along the seam, still carrying the faintest scent of lavender oil and leather. Not store-bought perfume. This was the kind Ellie kept tucked in with her mother's old letters. He turned it over in his hand. One side was darker than the other. Blood. He folded it once, slowly. She passed through here. Jacob scanned the gulch below. But not alone. They found more signs in the dust. Mules. 3, maybe 4. Barefoot tracks. Sandals. One set of heavier prints. Apache war moccasins. Deep impressions. Worn heels. Experienced traveler. Then smaller ones, lighter, inconsistent. Ellie. Her steps were close to one of the larger sets, maybe tethered, not fighting, not running, just taken. Wasn't no raid, Jacob said. If it were, she'd be dead already, or worse. John didn't answer. He didn't like guesses. He only believed what the land could prove. The gulch narrowed again. On either side, canyon walls rose high, layered in red rock and ghost-white clay. The wind funneled through like a whisper, carrying with it the smell of sage, ash, and smoke. Jacob pulled his horse to a halt. "You smell that?" "Campfire," John said. He dismounted without sound, unsaddled the rifle and checked the chamber, motioned for Jacob to stay close. They crept up the slope, through brush, around a boulder, slick with ancient petroglyphs, sun symbols, antelope, spirals that had no clear beginning or end. John paused, one hand brushing the stone. The Apache called this Tubi'ike, the hollow of smoke. Not a place for the curious, a place for the tested. They crawled higher until the ridge leveled out, and there, far below, across a dry basin ringed with juniper and volcanic rock, they saw a thin column of smoke winding toward the sky. And movement. 3 figures, 2 on foot, 1 on horseback. Too far to make out faces, but one of them, small, shoulders slumped, hands bound, moved like she was trying not to fall. The other walked beside her, not pushing, not pulling, just watching. John lowered the rifle slowly. "That's her," Jacob exhaled. "You sure?" John nodded once. "A father knows." They retreated behind the rock, breath tight, hearts louder than boots. Jacob wiped sweat from his brow. If they camped here, they'll move by first light. Maybe before. Then what? John looked to the sky. The light was dimming, afternoon falling into evening like a slow hand sliding down the back of the world. He stared toward the far side of the basin, toward where the trail disappeared into a canyon that turned back east. We wait. For what? For her to come back, or for me to go in? Jacob paused. "You really think you can ride into Apache camp and pull her out?" John didn't move. But I can ride into hell if I have to." Night dropped fast in the dry serpent. The riders on the basin floor had lit a small fire. Low flame, well concealed, no horses nearby, likely hobbled just beyond view. John kept watch from the rocks above, rifle across his knees, hands steady. He saw the girl huddle near the flame, saw her lower her head when another figure passed her a bowl, maybe water, maybe something else. Saw her take it with both hands, not resist, not fight. She looked worn, bruised in spirit more than skin, but alive. And then something else happened. The man who gave her the bowl sat down beside her, not close, just enough to share the fire. He said nothing, neither did she, but they stayed like that for some time. Jacob leaned in. "That one, you think he's the one who took her?" John squinted. "Maybe. Why is he treating her like—" He stopped, couldn't find the right word. John did. Like a guest, not a prize. It didn't make sense, not in any world he'd known. But then again, not everything needed to. Sometimes a man's eyes told more truth than his rifle ever could. John watched the fire burn low. The girl leaned back slowly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time. And the Apache man, the quiet one, turned slightly, just enough to keep her in sight, like he wasn't guarding her, like he was keeping her safe. Part 3. In the Hands of Strangers, Smoke, Silence, and the Wild. Ellie Brody's wrists ached from the bindings. Leather thongs, not too tight to cut skin, but snug enough to remind her of her place with every bump along the trail. They hadn't gagged her. There'd been no need. Words had dried in her mouth hours ago, and even if she'd had something left to say, no one here would have listened. She rode side saddle on a dusty mule that groaned at every incline. Above them sky bled into stone, red cliffs rising in waves like frozen fire peeled open by time. The air was thin, high desert dry, her throat scratched with every breath. They hadn't hit her, hadn't spat, but they hadn't looked at her like a person either, except one. The youngest rider didn't speak, didn't touch her, just rode near, quiet and straight-backed, his pony stepping light over stone. His face was painted in war stripes when they'd first taken her, one crimson slash under each cheekbone. But as the hours passed and the sun stripped all things bare, only his eyes remained sharp, watchful, unreadable. They didn't call him anything when they spoke. What few words they did trade were low, fast, mostly Apache. But Ellie heard his name once, caught like a falling pebble between gusts of wind. Chaska. He had the look of someone born in high places, wide cheekbones, hair tied with care, and a stillness in the saddle that said he belonged to the land more than the tribe. He never smiled, never scowled. He just watched. When they paused at a narrow shelf overlooking the hollow basin, one of the older warriors gestured for Ellie to dismount. Her knees buckled as her boots hit ground, and she fell hard onto gravel. No one moved to help, except Chaska. He didn't touch her, just knelt nearby, then stood again slowly, like showing her how to rise without shame. She didn't look at him, but she didn't turn away either. That night they made camp beside a dry creek bed, the ashes of past fires scattered like old bones. They hobbled the mules and lit a single flame low against a wall of stone. No tents, just blankets, rawhide satchels, and bedrolls under the open eye of the stars. Ellie sat apart, back to the rock wall, hands finally unbound but stiff from hours of strain. She didn't speak, didn't cry. She'd done all that when the saddle tore beneath her and the world went red. This was something else now, not panic, not pleading, just the kind of silence that settles in deep after you realize no one's coming. And then Chaska did something she hadn't expected. He approached her, not slow like someone afraid of spooking a deer, not fast like someone seeking control, just walked with the kind of weight that said he'd never learned to rush. He set a wooden bowl down before her. Water, not much, but clear and cool, not from the creek. He must have carried it. Beside the bowl he placed a sprig of dried sweetgrass, freshly cut, bound with a single strand of horsehair. Then, still saying nothing, he bowed his head and sat on the other side of the fire. Ellie stared, not at the bowl, at him. She had known fear, real fear, the kind that claws your stomach open from the inside. She'd seen men smile before they hurt women. She'd smelled their sweat, felt the weight of their hands. But this was different. This was restraint, no promises, no comfort, just water and the courtesy of presence. She touched the bowl. It was cool. A thin rim, handmade, possibly carried for days. She lifted it, sipped, and for the first time since her world had flipped, she didn't taste metal. Later, when the others had fallen into restless sleep, blankets pulled over faces, rifles within reach, Ellie stayed awake. So did Chaska. He didn't look at her, but he didn't drift off like the others either. His eyes followed the firelight, like he saw shapes inside it only he could understand. And though the sky above was strewn with more stars than Ellie had ever thought possible, her gaze kept slipping sideways to that lone figure beside the flame, the one Apache who hadn't tied her, hadn't shouted, hadn't traded cruelty for dominance. What unsettled her most was that she didn't hate him. She wanted to, needed to, but something about his silence wasn't emptiness. It was something held back. She knew that feeling. She'd worn it herself. The second day brought harsher land. No trees, only thorned brush and broken shale. Her boots were cracked by then. Her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth. At mid-morning, one of the older riders tried to adjust her reins, tugged too hard. She stumbled forward. Chaska moved before she could fall. Not rushed, not showy, just enough to catch her elbow and steady her. The other man scowled, muttered something in Apache. Chaska didn't reply, just let go and walked on. Ellie watched him for a long time after that. Something was shifting, not in the group, not in the land, in her, and she hated it, because the man she feared least was supposed to be her enemy. Part 4. The girl's name and the secret in her hair. The third morning began without warning, just a pale gold hush spreading over the desert, so quiet even the birds hadn't dared speak yet. Ellie was already awake. She hadn't really slept. The night had been long, filled with shallow dreams, and the muffled sounds of horses shifting their weight, fire popping soft in the wind. She kept her back to the cliff wall, knees drawn close, fingers curled around the hem of her dress, where the fabric was stitched thicker than the rest. That's where she'd sewn it. The silver hairpin, her mother's, shaped like a kite caught mid-flight, wings bent, tail curling like a flame in the wind. One of the few things she'd kept close since the grave had taken Ma, and the world had turned sharp around the edges. She hadn't dared look at it since they'd taken her, but she knew it was still there, threaded beneath layers of cotton and memory, until it wasn't. Chaska had moved like a whisper while the others broke camp. He hadn't touched her, he never did, but his eyes had scanned the trail ahead and then flicked just once to the hem of her dress where the thread had been picked loose by thorns. The hairpin lay half exposed, a sliver of silver glinting like water in the dust. Ellie froze. It wasn't just a trinket, it was the last piece of home that hadn't been stolen or left behind. If he took it now, if he pocketed it like spoil, she knew something inside her would collapse for good. But Chaska didn't reach for it. Instead, he crouched, quietly, so the others wouldn't notice, and let his fingers graze the earth near the pin, not the pin itself. Then with deliberate care, he lifted it from the ground and brushed off the dirt. Not with the quick flick of a thief, but with the soft pressure of someone tending a wound. He held it up. The morning light kissed the metal, and then he looked at her. Not long, not piercing, just enough to say, "I see this matters." He didn't ask for permission. He offered it back. Ellie's fingers trembled as she reached for it, but the pin never touched her palm. Not yet. Before he let go, he spoke, just one line. English, but stiff like a door unused for years, creaking on rusted hinges. "Wind? Where are you from? Does it chill like here?" The question struck her harder than if he'd slapped her, because it wasn't about the weather. Not really. It was the first thing he'd ever said to her. And it wasn't a demand. It wasn't even curiosity dressed in mockery. It was wonder, a question without barbs. She stared at him, for the first time, not as a captor, not even as Apache, just as a man trying to understand something that didn't quite fit the world he'd known. Her voice had all but vanished over the past days, dried up in her throat like creek beds in July, but somehow It cracked loose now. Wyoming, she whispered so quiet the word nearly broke apart. The wind there's colder, but it don't bite like this. Chaska nodded, like he understood the difference. Then he placed the pin gently into her open hand, bowed his head, and walked away. Ah. She sat with the hairpin, resting in her palm for a long time. She didn't cry, she didn't dare, but something uncoiled inside her. Not trust, not yet, maybe not ever. But the sharpest part of her fear dulled, just a notch, and that notch meant everything. The trail that day grew harsher, ridge after ridge, the stone biting through her boots, heat pressing down with a weight too dry for sweat. At one point, her legs gave out halfway up a rise. The men behind her hissed in their tongue. She expected to be dragged, kicked, maybe. She braced for it. Instead, Chaska doubled back. He didn't lift her, didn't reach. He just stood behind, close enough for her to know she wasn't alone. Step, he said, pointing. His hand hovered near her elbow, not touching, but waiting, like he was offering steadiness, not force. She rose, by her own power, but not by herself. That night, after the fire had burned low and the stars took back the sky, she did something she hadn't since her capture. She pulled the pin from her pouch and brushed out her hair. She didn't do it for them. She did it for Ma, because there were things a woman didn't let the wild steal from her, not even in silence. Dignity was one of them. Her hair hung loose over her shoulders, catching bits of starlight. And though no one said a word, Chaska looked across the fire, not long, just once. And in that glance there was no claim, no pity, just acknowledgement. Like maybe he too had something hidden in the folds of memory that he wasn't ready to name. Ellie didn't sleep beside the warriors, but she didn't sleep apart either. She found a patch of ground not far from where Chaska sat, sharpening a blade. Still within the light of the fire, but no longer outside it. That night, when the wind shifted and the desert let out its sighing groan, she didn't feel like prey. She felt watched, but not hunted. She felt witnessed, and it shook her, more than being taken ever had. Part 5. Willow Smoke and the Song Not Meant for Warriors. The fire they gave her wasn't much. A shallow ring of coals no bigger than a stew pot, circled by 3 stones with their edges rounded from years of heat. But to Ellie Brody, who hadn't known warmth since the night her horse fled, it was enough. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of juniper and animal hide, her eyes trained on the shapes that moved beyond the firelight. Figures she couldn't read, couldn't name. Sometimes they glanced her way. Most times they didn't. She didn't speak. Neither did they. The silence between them was not empty. It had a weight. From a distance a woman approached, moving like a shadow through low brush and firelight. She didn't wear feathers or bright beads, just a single braid tied with string and a wrap of faded wool over her shoulders. She carried a bundle of herbs and something steaming in a carved bowl. Ellie tensed, but the woman knelt beside her slowly, like one might approach a frightened foal in a snowstorm. She set the bowl down on a flat rock, then unwrapped the bundle. Sage, pressed and tied with sinew. Not for cooking. This was something older. The woman touched 2 fingers to Ellie's forehead, muttered words Ellie didn't understand, then waved the sage in slow circles through the rising steam. Then she sang, software almost broken in tone. No rise or rhythm, just breath and syllables that drifted upward like ash. Not meant for ears like Ellie's, but she heard it anyway, and something inside her lungs unclenched. The woman leaned back, spoke. Willow Smoke, she pointed to herself, then to Ellie. A question, unspoken. Ellie didn't answer, not at first, but after a long breath she whispered, "Ellie." It came out rough, like her voice had rusted. Willow Smoke gave a small nod. Not approval, not welcome, just acknowledgement. Then she stood and disappeared again. The bowl of hot liquid stayed behind. So did the warmth. Chaska watched from where he leaned near the tent poles. He hadn't said a word since they arrived in camp. Not to Ellie, not to Iron Bear, only to the white horse who stood tethered and chewing on dry reeds. But when he saw Willow Smoke kneel at Ellie's side, he stopped sharpening his blade and listened. He didn't smile. He never did. But something behind his eyes softened, like dust settling after a long wind. Later that night, Ellie tasted the stew left for her, thin but hot and made with a hand that understood hunger. She wrapped herself tighter in the wool, not to block out cold, but to preserve the strange sense of being noticed. A child wandered past with a goat bladder full of water. A man sat cross-legged, humming while he mended a net. There was life here, real and pulsing, and none of it revolved around her. She was not captive nor guest, just presence. No one asked her for anything. No one touched her. But no one threw stones either. That, she realized, might be the first grace she'd known in weeks. The stars came out like they always did, unconcerned with war or fear or blood on saddles. Ellie lay back and watched them, arms folded beneath her head, thinking of the porch back home, the wood grain she used to trace with her fingers when waiting for her father to return from branding cattle. Back then, she thought silence was something you had to fill with words. Now, it felt like armor, or maybe prayer. She heard the faint hum of someone singing again, off toward the canyon's edge. It wasn't Willow Smoke, it was Chaska. The tone was different, low, not meant to carry but strong. Not a song for women or fire, a song for memory. And Ellie, with her eyes on the stars and her back on unfamiliar earth, realized the thing she feared most wasn't death anymore. It was becoming numb, and this place, these quiet people, were keeping that numbness at bay. In the morning, Willow Smoke returned. No herbs this time, just a thin wedge of cornbread on a scrap of buckskin. She set it down without a word. Ellie looked up. "I don't have anything to give back," she said, flat but honest. Willow Smoke didn't answer, just tapped 2 fingers over her heart once, then turned and walked away. Chaska passed by a moment later, paused, saw the bread, then looked at Ellie. She stared back at him, waiting for a jest, a warning, some test of loyalty, but all he said was, "You eat slow." She blinked. "Is that an insult?" His lips didn't move much, but there was a flicker of something at the corner. Maybe it was a smile. "I mean, you eat like someone who knows what it's worth," he said, then walked on. That night, when Ellie took the cornbread in her hand, she broke it in half, laid one piece on a stone and pushed it forward toward the white horse. He didn't eat it, but Chaska saw, didn't say a word. He just tipped his head slightly, and that was enough. Because sometimes in a land like this, a gesture is all the language 2 people need. Part 6, The Shadow of Iron Bear and the Weight of Old Law. In the canyons where no maps reached and the sky pressed low with heat, the camp took shape like something grown from the land itself. Not built, just there. A scatter of lean-tos and earth-colored canvas near a spring that trickled out of rocks like it had been forgotten by God, but remembered by the people. Ellie sat near the fire, her back to a slab of stone still warm from the sun. Her hands worked slow around the hairpin, threading it back beneath the hem of her dress. She hadn't spoken since the night before, but she'd watched, listened, absorbed. Children moved in barefoot silence. Women passed with dried meat and bundled herbs, never looking her in the eye. Dogs curled beneath low branches. The Apache spoke softly in the evenings, louder in the morning, but never of her. Except one. He came like a wind shift. Not loud, not sudden, but you could feel it in your skin before you saw him. His name was Iron Bear, and even Ellie, who'd only heard it once, knew he was the one they all deferred to without saying so. You didn't need a badge or a crown to be in charge out here. You just needed presence. And Iron Bear had it in spades. He wasn't old, maybe 30, but his stare made him ancient. When he looked at Ellie, it wasn't hate. It was calculation. Like a man staring at a broken rifle to see if it was worth fixing or better sold for scrap. Chaska stood a few paces off, arms crossed, but didn't step in. Iron Bear squatted near the fire, picked up a stick, and stirred the embers once. Then again. "You speak her language?" he asked without looking at Chaska. "I know enough," Chaska said, low. "Too much," Iron Bear muttered. The stick cracked in his hand. He tossed it aside, then he turned to Chaska. "She's not your burden, she's leveraged. Or haven't you seen what Mexican rebels pay for white flesh with rancher blood?" Ellie flinched but didn't move. Chaska's jaw flexed. "She's not a trade." Iron Bear's smile was thin. "Every man thinks that, until he's starving or bleeding or watching a fire burn too close to the cradle." He rose, not in anger, but like someone ending a conversation they considered beneath them. "You forget," he said, "I knew your father. He gave the council his word when you were just learning how to ride, that you'd honor the old laws. You take this too far, cousin, and it won't be the girl who pays the price." He walked off, not waiting for a reply. Chaska didn't follow, didn't speak, just stood there. The fire between them popped once, then silence folded over the camp like a saddle blanket. Later that night, Ellie couldn't sleep. The air had cooled, but her chest felt tight, like someone had cinched a rope under her ribs. She rose quietly and walked toward the spring. There, in the shadows, she found Chaska, alone, sharpening his knife, not with purpose, just motion, trying to keep stillness at bay. "You shouldn't be out," he said. His voice wasn't sharp, just weary. Ellie knelt on the flat stone beside the water. She didn't look at him. "You didn't deny it," she said softly. "When he said I was leverage." Chaska didn't answer for a long moment. Then, "If I deny, he calls me weak. If I agree, I become him. Sometimes silence is the only choice left to a man without power." She turned to him. "But you have power. You chose not to give me up." Chaska met her eyes then, and it was like seeing something deep crack open, just a sliver. Not for pity, not for explanation, just to let in a slant of moonlight. "I've seen what happens," he said. "When we hand people to wolves, the wolves never stay satisfied." Ellie's throat tightened. "You've done it before?" Chaska looked away. But I watched another man do it once. She screamed his name for days. The trader's horse dragged her all the way past Knife Rock. There was blood in the dirt for weeks. We said it was the price of survival, but it felt like the cost of something worse. He stood then, too sudden, like the weight of what he remembered didn't sit well in his chest. "I won't let it happen again." And he walked off into the shadows, knife still in hand, but not raised. The next morning, Iron Bear held a council near the circle of cedars. Not a trial, just talk. That was how decisions got made here, with quiet words and shared glances and memory longer than steel. Willow Smoke stood nearby, not close to Ellie, but not far either. Watching, the council argued low, but Ellie caught some words. Trade. Brody girl. Guns. Breaking oath. White fire. She didn't know what that last one meant, but it felt like they were talking not just about her presence, but her effect. Like she'd brought something dangerous without knowing. Chaska stood alone. No weapon, No plea, just the same stance he always carried, like someone who'd walked long roads alone and learned not to lean too hard on anyone. When Iron Bear spoke, the others nodded. When Chaska answered, they frowned. It wasn't going his way, and yet he didn't shift, didn't ask for mercy, just stood there like the desert itself, quiet, battered, but immovable. That was when Ellie understood. This wasn't just about her. It was about what kind of man Chaska had decided to be, and how much it might cost him, even if no one else ever knew. That night, Ellie placed the hairpin by the fire again, not hidden, visible. Chaska saw it, paused. She didn't say anything, but she left it there until the fire burned down low. Then she picked it up, tucked it away, and nodded once. A quiet gesture, not forgiveness, not surrender, just this: I see what you're doing, and I won't forget. Part 7. First Rain and the Sign of the White Horse. The clouds came in slow, like cattle reluctant to cross a stream. They rolled over the high desert in bands of gray and copper, trailing long threads of wind behind them, whispering in the tall grass as if warning the ground to brace. It hadn't rained in weeks. The dry air had a brittle taste, like flint and dust. But that afternoon, as Ellie sat with her back against a juniper stump, carving shapes into the packed earth with a stick, she caught a scent she hadn't known she missed: petrichor, that quiet promise of coming rain. She looked up. The children in the camp had already stopped playing. Men stepped away from the fire, eyes narrowed at the sky. Women hurried to gather hides and clothing from lines strung between pinyon trunks. The hush before it broke was so thick even the horses stilled. Then, first like fingers drumming a tabletop, then faster, firmer, the rain came. Ellie didn't run for cover. She stood there in it, hair falling over her eyes, shoulders drawn but not in fear, just listening. The rain pattered against her skin in fat, cold drops that seemed to carry away more than dust. Something tighter, something deeper. She closed her eyes, and for a moment forgot where she was, forgot what had happened. Just let it fall. From across the clearing, Chaska watched her. He didn't blink much, didn't flinch either, even when thunder rolled behind the cliffs. Others ducked into lean-tos. Chaska moved toward the white horse. He untied the reins slowly, reverently, as though waking an elder. The horse, a tall, raw-boned gelding with a single dark mark behind one eye, tossed its head once, then settled. Chaska whispered something into its ear, then led it across the clearing toward Ellie. She turned when she heard the hoofbeats on wet earth. He didn't say anything, didn't ask. He simply stopped a few steps from her and extended the reins upward, an offering, not as captor, not as rescuer, not even as friend, just as someone making space for choice. Her eyes searched his face. There were no guarantees there, no promises, just a stillness that felt more honest than all the vows she'd heard in church pews back home. She looked at the horse, then back at Chaska. She didn't nod, didn't smile, just reached out and laid her hand against the saddle horn. It wasn't leather, it was braided rawhide, weathered and worn from years of use, shaped by a hand that cared for what it carried. She let her palm rest there, and for a second, the world held its breath. They didn't leave that night, but they packed, quietly. Chaska wrapped dry meat in a scrap of deer hide, tucked it into a pouch. Ellie helped roll the blankets tight. Willow Smoke didn't ask where they were going. She just handed them a small bundle of herbs wrapped in cloth and whispered 2 words that sounded like wind through trees. Chaska understood. Ellie didn't, but she bowed her head just the same. They chose the ridge trail, steep, narrow, away from the known paths where iron bears, men might give chase. The white horse carried most of their weight. Ellie walked beside Chaska until her feet blistered, then he lifted her up without a word. Not a chivalrous gesture, just a practical one. The way you'd move a friend from sun to shade, she asked once in the pale half-light of morning. You ever been north? Chaska shook his head. Not far. Me neither, she whispered. They kept walking. The days stretched. And in that space, something else did too. Not love, not yet, but a kind of respect that lives in silence. A knowing. He slept with his knife beneath his bedroll, so did she, but neither felt the need to reach for it in the dark anymore. On the fourth night, as they camped beneath a narrow overhang of sandstone, rain came again, but this time Chaska built a fire first, and when Ellie looked up at him, damp hair clinging to her cheek, she didn't thank him. She just passed him the bread she'd saved from earlier, half of it, still warm from her coat. He accepted it without ceremony, and in that trade, food for fire, silence for shelter, something unspoken began to grow, not fast, not bright, but steady. Just before sleep, Ellie whispered, almost too quiet for wind to carry, "If I don't make it back." Chaska looked at her. She stared into the flames. "I'd rather die on my feet with someone who didn't lie to me than safe in a house full of people who never told the truth." Chaska didn't nod, didn't speak, but he leaned slightly toward her, and in that tilt, that small shift, Ellie understood. He had chosen her too, not because she was white or wounded or female, but because she saw him as more than a shadow in war paint, and that was enough. Part 8. The Thunder Pass Chase. They broke camp before the first light. No fire, no clatter, no words. Chaska led the white horse by hand through a narrow arroyo that curved like a snake's spine between red rock cliffs. Ellie followed close, boots light on the sand, her breath visible in the chill. The pack was tighter now, provisions cut down, risk weighed against every extra blanket or stone flint. Somewhere behind them, the world they left had begun to stir. An iron bear was already awake. The first sound came like thunder with no sky. Hoofbeats. Not many, maybe 5, 6 riders, but coming fast, close. Ellie turned to Chaska, eyes sharp. He said nothing, just vaulted into the saddle and reached a hand for her. She didn't hesitate. They were moving before the sun breached the ridge. Thunder Pass had earned its name from the way sound bounced between walls. The narrow corridor of stone turned every gallop into an avalanche, every shout into something primal and distorted. As they rode, loose shale crumbled beneath the horses' hooves. One slip could mean a fall into the gorge below. Ellie gripped tight, face against Chaska's back, eyes locked on the curve of his shoulder, watching how his body shifted with each turn, how he guided the horse not with fear, but with trust. In him, in the land, in whatever silent force had kept him alive this long. Behind them the riders closed in. Iron Bear was in the lead. His face wasn't rage. It was something colder, conviction, and that was worse. A shot rang out. Stone exploded inches from Ellie's ear. She ducked instinctively, the sound echoing like a scream through the canyon. Chaska didn't flinch, just drove the white horse harder, pushing through a gap barely wide enough for a man, let alone a horse and 2 riders. The horse balked. Chaska murmured something low, not English, not Apache, just something ancient, and the horse went. They made it down the slope into the wide basin beyond Thunder Pass, a place where dry creek beds split like spiderwebs and offered no clear trail. Chaska wheeled left, then right, doubling back to confuse the prince. He didn't look behind him. He didn't have to. He knew they'd follow, not because they were fast, but because they believed they were right. Midday, heat rising. The white horse stumbled, just once, and Ellie felt it before she saw it. Blood, from the left flank, not the horse. Chaska, an arrowhead, black and barbed, jutted from just below his shoulder blade. He didn't make a sound, but his grip on the reins trembled. "Say, stop," she said, her voice dry, sharp. "Chaska, stop." He didn't, until he did. The white horse collapsed at the edge of a dry wash. Not dead, not broken, just spent. Chaska slid from the saddle and caught himself on one knee. Blood dripped to the dust. Still, he stood. Still, he turned to her. "Run," he said. The word felt foreign in his mouth. Now. But Ellie didn't run. She stepped toward him, eyes blazing with something that had nothing to do with fear. "I'm not leaving you." He shook his head. "You have to." "I won't." And he saw it, what she wasn't saying, that she'd been left before, that if she ran now she'd carry that wound again. And maybe he had too, so he didn't argue. He just collapsed. She dragged him, half limping, half hauling, into the wash. The shadows there were deep, cool. She ripped at her shirt, tore it into strips, pressed hard against the wound to stanch the bleeding. His breath came in sharp gasps, but he stayed conscious, barely. "You took that for me," she said, hands sticky with blood. "No," Chaska murmured, "oh, for us." And she wept, not loud, not broken, but the kind of crying that made no sound, only shaking shoulders and clenched fists, like a child who knew she couldn't fix what was broken but tried anyway. The pursuit faded for now. Iron Bear, perhaps, had lost the trail, or maybe he'd seen enough, but Ellie knew it wasn't over. Not yet. She let Chaska rest, his head in her lap, while the desert wind stirred the yellow grass and carried away the blood scent from the rocks. For the first time. She didn't think about getting home. She thought about staying alive. For both of them. Later, as dusk crept in, she whispered into the dark, "I used to think the worst thing was being taken." She looked down at him. "It's not." Chaska's eyes opened, just barely. "It's being forgotten." He didn't answer, but his fingers curled around hers and held. Part 9. Blood on a shirt and city eyes in the wild. The sky above them dimmed from burnt gold to bruised plum, a kind of hush settling over the canyon like the land itself was holding its breath. Somewhere in the distance a coyote yipped once, then nothing. Ellie sat beside the half-collapsed lean-to they'd found, barely more than 2 angled slabs of pine pressed into a rocky outcropping. It leaned, like everything out here, as if uncertain how long it still belonged. Inside, Chaska lay half-curled on a blanket of dried moss and pine boughs, shirt off, skin slick with sweat. The broken arrow now gone. She dug it out with her belt buckle. Had to. No one else was coming. Her hands were still stained from it, brown-red crust beneath her nails, blotches darkening the frayed edge of her blouse. She tore that blouse into strips, stitched what she could from its seams. Her thread was a bootlace, her needle a thorn. She'd never sewn anything more important, and never so silently. Chaska's chest rose and fell like a forge bellow, slow, determined. The bleeding had eased, but fever lingered. He didn't talk much. He hadn't since the wound. But Ellie kept close, watching every breath like it might be the last. Every now and then he muttered in his sleep, words she didn't understand, but one name came more than once. Tahu. Not a threat, a memory, or maybe a wound deeper than arrows. She boiled water in a bent tin cup she'd found half buried in sand near the lean-to. It took nearly an hour over a flicker of twigs. The cup had a chip in the rim, but the handle still held firm. She wrapped it in a strip of her skirt, held it to Chaska's lips. He drank, just a sip. "Easy," she said. "You're not made of iron." His eyes flicked open then, just barely, but enough for her to see something behind them. Not pain, not even gratitude. Recognition, like he saw her now as something more than the girl tied to a horse. She didn't look away. I had a dog once, she whispered. Back home. Ugly old thing. Wouldn't let anyone near him but me. Chaska blinked. Some folks said he was too mean to love, she said, her voice growing smaller. But he came to me that first winter after Mama died. Slept at my door every night, never asked for nothing. She smiled faintly, almost apologetic. Don't know why I'm telling you this. But she did. Because the silence around him felt less like a wall now, more like a space where things could grow. Later, when the fever broke, Chaska shifted and muttered again. This time she caught the words in English. Wind, don't stay. Ellie leaned closer. What? His eyes stayed closed, but his lips moved. Wind, don't stay, he repeated slower. Don't choose. Where it blows. She sat with that a while, not just the words, but what they left unsaid. She thought of the wind, how it moved through the ridges back home, through cottonwood leaves and the holes in her daddy's old barn. It didn't ask where it belonged. It just went. When the moon rose silver through a slit in the rock above, she took Chaska's shirt and began to wash the blood from it. She used sand first. Then what little water they could spare. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from care. It was strange, she thought, how you could hate someone once, then find yourself cradling the stain of their blood like it mattered more than your own. She spread the shirt out over the lean-to to dry, sewed the biggest tear closed with pine thread and a thorn. Her stitches were crooked but firm. Chaska stirred once, saw her sewing. You mend, he rasped. She looked over. You bleed. A corner of his mouth almost smiled. Almost. In the days that followed, he regained his strength slowly. He didn't speak much, but he watched her, how she stacked firewood by size, how she looped her belt around the lean-to's opening to hold it tighter against the wind, how she offered him half her portion of the last strip of dried venison. Little things, but the right things. One morning, as the frost melted in streaks across the stone, she sat near the fire, humming something her mother used to sing. A song with no words, just the shape of sorrow turned soft at the edges. Chaska listened, didn't say a word, but when the fire died down, he added 2 small branches, not because it was cold, but because the song hadn't finished. That night she told him about the bell on the porch, how her father rang it every morning after her mother passed, one clang for coffee, one for memory, how it used to echo across the canyon, all the way to the far hill. Every day, she said, even when there wasn't anyone to hear. Chaska looked at her a long time, then said quiet, Sound like dream. She tilted her head. Yeah? He nodded once. If it is, I hope morning never wakes. Ellie smiled then. Not wide, not showy, but real, like something cracked open inside her chest, and what leaked out was light. They didn't talk much after that, didn't need to. The fire between them burned lower, but not out, and when she looked at him now, she didn't see a warrior who once tied her hands. She saw the man who gave her water before words, who bled so she wouldn't, who listened, not with ears, but with stillness. Sometimes that was louder than any promise. Part 10. Clayton Brody and the Gun Behind the Ridge. The sun hadn't yet cleared the ridgeline when the first sound split the quiet, the sharp, unnatural crack of gunfire striking stone. Ellie's body reacted before her mind did, jerking sideways just as a splinter of granite zipped past her cheek and buried itself in the lean-to wall behind her. Chaska didn't move. He didn't need to. He'd heard the echo from the moment the trigger was pulled. His eyes found hers instantly. Down below, maybe 30 paces from the base of the ridge, a man stood, rifle lowered, smoke curling from the barrel. Clayton Brody, half-brother, full trouble. He hadn't changed much, not in build, not in bitterness. Same squared jaw, same boots scuffed from towns, not trails. Same eyes that always watched too long and cared too little. But there was a hollowness in him now, too. Something that looked like pride left out in the sun too long. "You're a hard woman to find," Clayton called. Ellie didn't answer. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate. The way men walked when they didn't want to spook a horse or a lie. "Daddy's worried sick," he said, brushing a pine needle off his shoulder. "Sends me to find you, and here you are, shacked up with a red man in the brush." She stood tall. Her hair was still damp from stream water. A strip of Chaska's shirt wrapped one wrist where a rock had caught her days earlier. She looked like someone who'd slept rough and survived finer things than comfort. "He saved my life," she said. Clayton tilted his head. "You sure about that?" She didn't blink. "I was there." He snorted. "You always had a heart too quick to feel and too slow to think." Then his eyes turned on Chaska, and the way he looked at him, it wasn't new. Ellie had seen that look before. In saloons, in jails, in bounty offices with posters on the wall and men pretending they weren't, hoping for trouble. "You got a name, Apache?" Clayton asked. Chaska didn't answer, just sat still beneath the lean-to, one hand under the blanket Ellie had draped across his chest. Clayton's lip curled. "Don't need a name, I guess. Your kind usually comes with a price tag, not a story." Ellie stepped between them, eyes locked. "I came with him willingly," she said. Clayton raised his rifle again, just a little. "You've been gone too long to remember where you belong, Ellie." She didn't step back. Not this time. "I never forgot," she said. "You just never liked the answer." There was a pause then. One of those silences that didn't just stretch but tightened. The wind shifted. A hawk cried somewhere overhead. Below, the world stilled like a held breath. Then Clayton's hand moved, subtle, slow, toward the hammer. And that's when Ellie did something she hadn't done since she was a child trying to pull a calf from breech without help. She stepped forward, stood right in front of the rifle's mouth, between her brother's aim and the man who bled for her in the wild. "You pull that trigger," she said, voice raw, "and I swear to God—" "Clayton, you'll bury me before you bury him." His hand froze. The moment held like a frayed rope above canyon wind. His jaw clenched. "He's Apache. I know what he is." She snapped. "I know better than you ever did what kind of man stands behind a gun. And what kind of man takes a wound and says nothing?" He hesitated, just long enough for the tremor to show in his jawline. "You gonna throw away blood for that?" he asked. Ellie didn't flinch. "Blood's not always kin." Behind her, Chaska shifted upright, didn't rise, didn't reach for a weapon, just watched, the way one man watches another dig his own grave with pride and half-truths. Clayton's shoulders dropped a fraction. Not surrender, not peace. Just the weariness of someone who came expecting something simple and found a mirror instead. "You were supposed to be the one with sense," he muttered. She held his gaze. "Maybe I finally got some." He lowered the rifle, just slightly. That's when the rustle of brush came from the side trail near the ridge. Another figure stepped into view. Willow smoke, barefoot, robe trailing dust, wind tugging strands of silver-black hair loose around her shoulders. She didn't speak, didn't raise a hand, just walked forward until she stood halfway between both parties, then stopped and slowly untied the leather bundle in her arms. A totem. Wood and stone bound by old law, old memory, the symbol of the mother line, sacred enough to silence even tribal chiefs, sacred enough that white men who'd seen blood still stepped back. Clayton went still. "Who is she?" he asked. Ellie glanced at Willow Smoke. "She's the one who's been watching the whole time." Clayton looked at the totem, then at Ellie, then at Chaska. He lowered the rifle. Not because he understood, but because something in him finally recognized that he didn't have the power to define what came next. Without another word, Clayton turned and walked back toward the ridge. No threats, no parting shots, just boots on rock fading into the wind, and the sound of Ellie's breath slowly evening out like a cord finally resolving after being stretched too tight. She turned to Chaska. "You okay?" He nodded once. "You stood." "I did." There was a pause. "I wasn't sure I could." "You did," he said. "That's all wind needs, one choice." She looked after her brother, then back to the man beside her, and for the first time in days, Ellie sat down, not from exhaustion but peace, a hard-earned one. Part 11. The Decision on the Edge. The morning wore on without a word spoken. The air between Ellie and Chaska was quiet, not hollow, not tense, just the sort of quiet that comes after something nearly broke but didn't. Like the hush after a storm that didn't rip the roof off, but still tested every nail. They sat in the half-shadow of the lean-to, Chaska's wound cleaned, packed again. The swelling along his ribs had gone down some, but his movements were still cautious. Every breath seemed measured, like he was counting the weight of air. Ellie stirred the last of the coffee over the fire. She didn't offer it, just placed the tin cup beside him and sat across, knees drawn up, hands resting loosely on her boots. "I always thought it'd be a bear," she said quietly. Chaska tilted his head. "What would?" "The first thing to try and kill me out here. Or maybe a rattler, not a man who shares my blood." Chaska didn't respond with words. He just picked up the coffee, held it for a moment between his palms, then set it down untouched. "You should go," he said finally, voice low. Ellie didn't look surprised. "Why?" He looked past her toward the trail where Clayton had disappeared. "I don't want war." She folded her hands. "And you think me leaving will stop it?" He hesitated. "If Iron Bear finds us, if my cousin sees that your people have come this far into our land, there will be no more words." "I stood between you and a gun," she said. "I know. I'm not running now." He looked at her then, and it wasn't distrust he held. It was fear, not of her, but of what she might lose by choosing him, what he might cost her. "You'd give up your name for me?" Ellie leaned back, arms crossed. "My name is Roof. It kept the sun off for a while, but it never kept me warm, not like this." He watched her for a long time, as if memorizing something he wasn't sure he'd be allowed to keep. "You shouldn't have to choose." "But I do." She stood, stepped around the fire, and knelt beside him. "Clayton came for a story," she said, "one he could sell, twist, claim, but I'm writing my own." She reached for his hand, not dramatic, not trembling, just firm. "And if you die here," she whispered, "then I'm no Brody anymore." The words hung there, not shouted, not demanded, just left like a stone on sacred ground, waiting to be honored or ignored. Chaska didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough. A look that had no English word, and maybe no Apache one either. Just the kind of gaze a man carries when he realizes someone has chosen him completely, even when the world hasn't. He moved his hand to cover hers. Then suddenly the brush rustled. Chaska turned his head sharply, but Ellie didn't pull away. From the shadows came Willow Smoke. She moved with the ease of someone who belonged to the land, not merely walked across it. Over one shoulder she carried the totem wrapped again in soft hide. Her face was unreadable, calm, but not soft. She stopped before them, without asking, without bowing. She knelt and set the totem between them. Ellie looked at her. "You followed?" Willow Smoke didn't answer. Instead, she unwrapped the bundle and placed a strip of willow bark across Chaska's wrist. Then she took a bit of ash from the fire, rubbed it between her fingers, and marked a small symbol on Ellie's forehead, a circle with a broken line through it. Chaska inhaled sharply. "That's the symbol of the edge," he said. Willow Smoke finally spoke. "You are no longer between worlds. You are on the edge of one. From here, you choose." She looked to Ellie. "You choose him, or you choose the story others already wrote for you." Chaska looked at Ellie. "You don't owe me this." Ellie didn't answer. Instead, she reached up, wiped the ash away gently, and said, "No, I don't. And that's why it's real." Willow Smoke smiled for the first time. Then she stood, left the totem, and faded back into the tree line, like fog pulled by morning light. That night, under stars so bright they hummed, Chaska and Ellie didn't speak of what came next. They didn't need to. They watched the fire burn low. They shared one blanket, and when she leaned into his side, he didn't stiffen. He simply turned his face toward her hair and breathed deep. Not of smoke, not of danger, but of something quieter, something earned, something that made the edge no longer frightening. Part 12. Sacred Fire and New Law Beneath the Moon. The fire had burned to a steady heart of coals by the time the others arrived. They came one by one, not as a war party, but as men and women who had heard something in the wind, a shift, a crack in the old rhythm of things. There was no war drum, no shouted command, just the sound of hooves and moccasins and the rustle of juniper branches underfoot. Iron Bear came last. His arrival stirred the dust like thunder, his stallion black as pitch, nostrils flaring. He dismounted with a grace born of years in the saddle and a burden too large for his shoulders. He didn't reach for his knife, didn't shout, just stepped forward and saw the sacred totem already laid between the young warrior and the girl with watchful eyes. For a moment his jaw clenched, not from rage, from knowing what this meant. Willow Smoke knelt beside the totem, her hands calm as ever, though firelight painted lines on her face that hadn't been there yesterday. She carried no weapon, only a small bundle of sweetgrass and a bowl of wind-warmed water. "You come for justice," she said to Iron Bear, "but justice already started." He didn't answer. His eyes drifted to Chaska, seated upright but pale, shoulders still bound, Ellie steady beside him, one hand resting on her knee, but close enough to his blade, if need be. "Did he tell you what he's done?" Iron Bear asked, not taking his eyes off Ellie. "No," she said. "Then let me. He broke our law. He took a captive and chose her over blood, over kin, over the promise of our people." Ellie didn't blink. Chaska stood, slow but without hesitation. He stepped around the fire. The crowd parted just enough. His voice was even, not raised to match Iron Bear's tone. "I didn't take her. I listened when she spoke. I watched when others only saw enemy, and I saw that she was not the danger." "You chose her over us," Iron Bear said, voice sharp. "I chose not to trade a person like cattle," Chaska replied, eyes unwavering. Iron Bear turned to Willow Smoke, perhaps expecting her to interject, to defend the old ways, but she didn't. She rose, holding the sweetgrass. The smoke spiraled gently upward, caught in a breeze that barely moved the sagebrush. "Our laws," she said softly, "are not stone. They were made by those who remembered fire, not just war." She handed the bowl to Chaska. "Drink," she said. He took it, though his hands trembled. The water tasted of ash and mint, cleansing and bitter all at once. Then she turned to Ellie. "You too." Ellie took the bowl, paused, then drank. She didn't flinch. Willow Smoke set the bowl down between them. "This is not a trial," she said. This is a right. Iron Bear frowned. You invoke the matriarch's law? I do. But she is not one of us. She is, Willow Smoke said, because she stayed. Because when the trail bent toward fear, she did not run. Because she did not ask to be accepted, but still gave more than many born beneath our stars. Silence, a quiet more profound than any thunder. Then Chaska stepped forward. He drew his knife, not in challenge but in offering. He laid it in the sand, blade pointed away. I do not leave the people, he said. I simply choose not to do harm. He looked up at Iron Bear. If you need to cast me out, do it, but don't pretend that killing her would have brought us peace. Iron Bear said nothing, just stared down at the blade, then at the girl, then at his cousin, who stood not as a rebel, but as a man with no armor left, only truth. A breath passed, then another. Finally, Iron Bear stepped forward and placed his own blade in the sand beside Chaska's. I don't agree with you, he said, but I won't spill kin blood to prove a point. His voice cracked just slightly. We're losing too many good men to bad reasons. And with that, he turned, mounted, and rode off, without ceremony, without anger, just a man carrying the weight of compromise. The rest lingered. They didn't cheer, didn't speak. They simply nodded, some to Willow Smoke, some to Ellie, and a few, even, to Chaska. When the crowd faded back into the desert like mist before noon sun, only the fire and the scent of sweetgrass remained. Ellie bent and picked up Chaska's blade. She wiped it with her sleeve and handed it to him, hilt first. You didn't lose your people tonight, she said quietly. No, he replied, but I think we all changed which people we belong to. Willow Smoke smiled once more. Then she whispered, The law held, but the law moved too. That night, beneath a moon so large it looked like it might tip from the sky, Ellie and Chaska sat again at the fire, not to hide, not to heal, but simply to be. And for the first time since the horse came home without her, she felt she had stopped running. Part 13. A new name in the Valley of Wind. They didn't leave the next morning, or the one after. The rains came gentle that season, not pounding like in stories, but soft enough to green the hollows without washing away the trails. Somewhere between sunrise and dusk, the urgency to go faded. No words declared it. No decision carved into bark. They just stayed. Ellie slept in a small lean-to near the edge of camp, beside a stand of crooked pines and a smooth patch of red earth. The wind always swept clear. Chaska built it with his own hands, wood from a broken wagon and a thatch of yucca rope. It wasn't much, but it held. Each day had its own quiet rhythm. At dawn, Ellie rose before the fire pit, even smoked. She fetched water from the stream below, her boots leaving clean prints in dew-soaked grass. Sometimes a child from the camp would follow her, never asking questions, just watching, and once handing her a wildflower without speaking. By midday, she worked alongside Willow Smoke, grinding corn between stones, learning to form flatbread without tearing the dough, twisting sage stems into bundles for drying. Her hands blistered at first, raw from labor, unfamiliar, but Willow Smoke never corrected her out loud. She only showed once, then walked away, trusting the girl to fail gently into learning. Ellie didn't ask to be taught the language, but it found her anyway, in the way a raven's call meant rain by night, or how the direction of smoke from the lodge told when someone grieved. She listened more than she spoke, and that, more than any grammar, earned her a place among them. One evening, a child called her Tsikani. Willow Smoke smiled. It means branch that bends, she explained, still rooted, but not broken. Ellie carried the name lightly, like a scarf against wind. something she hadn't asked for but warmed her just the same. Chaska spent most of his days along the outer trails, riding fence lines that didn't exist, listening for echoes that hadn't come yet. He wasn't avoiding her, but something in him understood that nearness didn't need to press close to be real. He gave her space to learn what belonging felt like when it wasn't handed to you out of pity or fear. But at night, after fires were banked and voices low, he'd return with an armful of pine or a new cut of meat, and they'd sit, not always together, but within the same circle of firelight. Some nights Ellie would whistle an old ranch song. Not all the notes were right, but the lilt of it carried something familiar to the darkening sky. Chaska never joined in, but once he reached into his bag and handed her a flute, crudely carved, the mouthpiece a little cracked. She held it like a gift too fragile to breathe on. "Not finished," he said, "but for you to shape." She nodded, unsure how to answer kindness without needing to return it right away. So instead, she worked. She practiced in the afternoons, under the pines, near the stream, with only birds for the audience. The notes came slow, hollow at first, but over time they gained weight. Not volume, but presence. Like wind threading through a canyon, there, not to be owned, only honored. One morning she found Chaska waiting near her lean-to. He held a strip of rawhide, braided, tight, looped at the end. "For the flute," he said, "or your wrist, however you choose." She took it, fingers brushing just long enough to register warmth. Then she tied it to the flute, not as a tether, but a reminder of a winter survived, of a law changed, of a name earned, not given. They never spoke of marriage. There was no ceremony, no loud promise under the sun. But as weeks passed, people began to nod when they saw them walking side by side. The way Chaska carried 2 water skins now. The way Ellie braided her hair to match the young girls in camp. The way she smiled when she carried back pine cones for fire starting, like the chore was an offering, not a burden. They shared a tent now, not because the old one wore thin, but because Ellie pulled her bedroll closer one cold night, and Chaska didn't shift away. That was all. That was enough. One day she planted grass, right where the white horse had once laid. After that night of rain and thunder and trust, she carried the water herself. Knelt in the dirt, dug with her fingers. No one asked why. But a boy from the camp wandered by, paused, and said, "Horse still watches from there, maybe." Ellie smiled. "Then it'll need shade." She didn't look for symbols, but they found her anyway, and she let them stay. Back at the Brody Ranch, the porch bell had long gone silent. The fields grew wild, the fence is half broken. But that wasn't her home anymore. It wasn't hate that kept her away, just knowing that where she was now, nothing had to be defended by blood to be worth belonging to. She hadn't lost her old name, but she'd gained one that didn't ask for sorrow to make it real. And in the Valley of Wind, every morning it whispered itself through pine and firelight. Not traded, not taken, chosen. Part 14. The wind still crosses 2 roofs. The valley didn't change all at once, but over time, the edges softened. What once was Apache land marked by fear and warning became a place where strangers lingered a little longer at the river bend. Smoke from the cook fires no longer meant danger, only dinner. Children from the surrounding hills sometimes crept close, drawn by the sound of flute music or the laughter of a boy chasing a chicken. And up near the ridge, where wild sage met stone and red cedar, a cabin stood, not large, not proud, just honest. Its roof was sloped to meet the wind. Its porch was built facing east, where the light came first, and carved into one of its beams, simple, without flair, was the mark of a soaring bird. A kite, if you knew how to look. On most mornings, Ellie sat in its shade, hair streaked now with sun and time, her hands tough from work but gentle at rest. On her wrist the rawhide loop had thinned with the years, but she never replaced it. Like the flute, like the silver pin beside the door, some things weren't meant to be made new, only carried forward. Chaska would come out later, after tending the goats or checking traps by the foothills. He didn't hurry, and she didn't wait in a way that needed noise. They just knew when the other would appear, like seasons turning in their own time. Their words were few, their living was plenty. A girl ran barefoot through the yard, light hair, dark eyes, chasing her brother with a stick she called a sword. He shrieked, tumbled, and popped up laughing. The boy was quieter, curious. He once pulled apart a grasshopper just to see how its legs worked, then buried it softly and sang to the dirt. They weren't raised to belong to one world or the other. They were raised to belong to both. In the evenings, Chaska taught them the words to old songs, soft syllables meant for dusk and stories. Ellie taught them how to grind coffee beans and measure rain in tin cups. They sat side by side, not knowing some would call them half-bloods, not caring that their parents never told them which side to pick. There were no sides here, only rooms with open doors. Sometimes willow smoke came, older now, but still carrying the look of someone who saw everything before it happened. She never stayed long, just enough to press her palm to Ellie's cheek, inspect the children's teeth, and leave dried bundles of something that always smelled like memory. One winter, Iron Bear stood at the edge of the clearing, not armed, just watching. He didn't speak, but he nodded, once, to Chaska, and that was enough to know the fire had burned through the old anger, not erased it, but cooled it. They never sent word to the Brody Ranch, not because there was nothing left, but because some chapters don't need closing to be done. Ellie knew Clayton still roamed, probably settled somewhere with a new story in his mouth and the same old emptiness under his boots. If he ever came this way, there was nothing to fear. He'd see the cabin, the porch, the children, the strength that couldn't be bought or borrowed, and he'd know. She didn't need him to understand, just to see. On the porch beam, the silver pin caught morning sun. Below it, an old bowstring, dry, looped, fraying, hung nailed in place. A reminder not of war, but of restraint, of how a weapon once lowered could become a roof beam, a lullaby, a heartbeat. The cabin never became legend. Ellie and Chaska weren't written into songs or told around fire circles. They didn't need to be, because their story didn't need telling. It just needed living, and it did. Every time the wind passed from pine to porch, every time the children laughed under a sky not divided by guns, every time the coffee steamed and someone brought in firewood without being asked. That was legacy enough. One spring morning, after the thaw, Chaska brought in a new pot of soil. Ellie knelt beside him, pressed her fingers into it, planting nothing yet, just feeling its weight, its dampness, its promise. He watched her for a moment, then said something rare. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you'd gone back?" She didn't look up. "No," she said. "I know what would have happened. I just don't live there." He smiled. The wind picked up, rattled the dried sage by the door, stirred the pin and the bowstring, just enough to make a soft sound, like breath, like memory, like wind crossing two roofs at once, one old, one chosen. And that was the ending they never needed to explain, because when a life is truly yours, it doesn't ask for a witness. It just leaves enough warmth behind to be felt. Some stories don't end with a gunshot or a wedding. They end with two people sitting on a porch, side by side. A breeze moving through tall grass. A child's laughter in the distance. and the quiet understanding that home isn't always where you were born. Sometimes it's where someone stayed when they didn't have to. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a silence, a face you still carry, leave a word below. Not for likes, just to say, I was here and I felt it too. Thanks for riding with us.